Fabulous. So could I welcome everyone to today's Natural Cambridgeshire Partnership Forum. Could I ask that if you are not our first speaker, to put your microphones on mute. We will be managing questions by using the participant sort of raising hand function, as there are quite a lot of people on the call today. And Helen and I will endeavour to look at the chat and make sure we are answering questions or passing people on. So I think there's not quite everybody on mute yet. Brilliant, if we could manage that, fantastic. So we have a wonderful array of speakers today with a focus on landscapes, which of course is hugely important in Cambridgeshire. And I wondered if I could start off by introducing our first speaker. So this is Brian Eversham.
Right. I think my wife may have
so whoever's
you.
Helen, can
let
you
me
pop
think.
on
I'm just going to see if I can find her. Is that okay? Can you just hold on a couple of minutes? Is that right? Okay, thank you. Bye now.
Sorry.
Okay, so Brian Eversham, as most people know, is Chief Executive of the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and Northamptonshire. Oh, there's so many things. He's Wildlife Trust's Chief Executive nearly everywhere near us. And has been in that position since 2009, where he introduced landscape scale and conservation of landscapes as a concept in that Wildlife Trust. He's also an elm expert. If any of you want to know anything about elms, Brian is your person to go to, and also a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. So a very broad spectrum naturalist. And also, seeing as we were on the subject of professorships, a visiting professor at Stanford University, where he lectures in ecological restoration. So today he's going to be talking about landscapes and landscapes in the context of our changing climate.
Yes.
So over to you, Brian.
May I ask you to bring me on my mobile?
Can you please mute your
please.
You can mute them, Helen, I think, from your position of admin.
I'm endeavouring to do so.
No problems.
So whoever is on as Cambridge, could they mute themselves, please? Okay, Brian, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you. I will now attempt to find the technology at this end and see if I can share my screen on the basis that if I drive it myself, it'll be a little swifter than if it's done remotely and I have to keep saying, next slide, please. If this lets me down, then we have a copy with Helen in reserve. Bear with me just a second while I fight with the most clunky keypad I've used in decades. So I hope that's now sharing something, and in a second it should go full screen so you can see the slide more clearly. Thumbs up, Helen, if you can see something there. Thank you. And again, struggling with the annoying pad. I will be there in a moment, I'm sure.
Ticking is your computer thinking.
I'm glad something's thinking. I'm simply losing the mouse on a regular basis. I should say my IT manager looked at it earlier and promises me a new keypad straight after this meeting, but he didn't have one sitting in the office, so it's now on order. Getting closer. Sorry about this, folks.
Just wondering if we switch, Brian.
So this is most frustrating. My apologies, everyone. I've never known a mouse jump so far for so little movement.
can I suggest we switch? And if Helen has it up, we just.
I
restart
think I'm
it.
there.
Oh,
Bear with me a
just at that
second.
moment.
Brian, can you use the key presses to do it rather than
I
mouse?
think we're there. My apologies.
Yeah, we are.
Right. So good morning, everyone. I have to say this is not the most comfortable of slots, and I'm trying to give you an overview of the whole county in front of an audience who may have lived here for twice as long as I have and know the sites even better. And before, so to speak, the speakers are going to go into each habitat in greater detail than I have time for. So this is going to be brief, sketchy, and at a reasonably high level. If my species examples overlap with other people, then that confirms we got the right ones. And if not, then it gives you a broader range. So I'll start up extremely briefly with the origins and geology of Cambridgeshire and its wildlife, touch briefly on national character areas which are surprisingly useful and meaningful as a way of capturing the diversity of landscapes on our patch, and then go through what I see as being the four broadest geological types which give rise to the habitats we're dealing with here: alluvium with river gravels, peat, boulder clay and chalk, and then to think of what's effectively new geology of a sort that we've not seen previously. The starting point is that for the last 3 million years, Cambridge's typical climate has been full glaciation, an ice age with permafrost in Cambridgeshire, the ice sheets coming down as far south as Leicestershire. So all of Cambridgeshire wildlife has had to migrate from here down to the Mediterranean and back again around 20 times in the last 3 million years. And during that time, there have been about 20 brief 10th to 15,000 year warm periods, such as the present one, where a similar set of wildlife has accumulated here. At the end of the Ice Age, our species were down there somewhere in Spain, southern France, Italy, and Eastern Europe, bearing in mind that until around 7,000 years ago, Britain was not an island. Those species could recolonize Britain up the west coast and across the Channel, straight across France and across the Channel, along the River Rhine and into the River Thames when the Thames was a tributary of the Rhine, and straight across Doggerland into eastern England. And I think it's no coincidence that Cambridge is at this sort of confluence of those various migratory routes, which could explain some of the juxtaposition of species that we see in our area today. Thanks very much to Cambridgeshire Geological Society, who has a very data-rich and easily understood website. This geological map of Cambridgeshire shows everything in a little more detail than I have time for. I just point you though to the topographic component, which shows the great heights of Huntingdonshire going up to several tens of meters, the even higher hills in the southeast, capped with boulder clay and overlooking the southern half of the Great Fen Basin. I'll now simplify this map very crudely indeed, and my apologies to any geologists who are on board the call. If my system will allow me to change slides. Maybe I should have taken Helen's offer after all. Not sure. We're there. So I'm summarising Cambridgeshire in very, very crude terms. We have the mostly marine silt in the northern quadrant. We have the belt of fen peats around us. We have the boulder clay cap on the west of the area and again in the south. And we have the stripe of chalk running across past Cambridge City. There's a bit of limestone around Peterborough, which I barely have time to talk about, so we'll skip that. The natural character areas capture this and point out a couple of other small features. So here we have the fens combining both the silt fens and the peat fens, but we also have creeping into the area at number 90, the Green Sand Ridge, which gives the southern edge of Cambridgeshire its only patch of good quality sandy heathland. And I would suggest that the Yardley Whittlewood Ridge, which is that stripe of ancient forests going from Yardley Chase and Whittlewood Forest in Northamptonshire across Bedfordshire, actually continues a fair bit further. And I would see Monk's Wood, the ancient woodland overlooking the Fen Edge, as the final step in the Yardley Whittlewood Ridge. So to start in the north with the silt fens, and this applies to quite a lot of the boulder clay on the slopes too. Current landscape is intensely arable, growing a range of extremely valuable crops. This is a landscape which would have been wooded, then with clearings, then most of the forest cleared by the Iron Age, followed through by gradual intensification, open field system till the end of the medieval period, enclosures with hedgerows over much of it, though less so on the silt fen than on the boulder clay, and finally with enlargement agricultural machinery, the loss of hedgerows and the very open landscape that we see today, with comparatively little wildlife. And a pulling slide, but just to remind you that over the last 5,000–7,000 years, on several occasions, much of the silt fen has actually been marine inundated to create salt marsh. And if we don't defend the east coast around the wash, then much of the silt fen will once again be salt marsh, at a loss to agriculture and a loss to fenland wildlife habitats. A more exciting part of alluvial habitats in our three counties are the river valleys. In Cambridgeshire, the Great Ouse and the Nen have some of the most spectacular riverine meadows anywhere in the country. The background picture here is Port Home, claimed by most people outside of Oxfordshire to be the largest hay meadow in lowland England, complete with snakehead fritillary and the beaded ground beetle, the most rapidly declining ground beetle in Britain and in most of Europe, thrives in the Ouse Valley and the Nen Valley, unlike most of the rest of the country. And we shouldn't forget the rivers themselves have significant biodiversity. The Great Ouse was the last turbot river in England and one of the strongholds for that sole member of the cod family in British freshwaters. We've lost the burbot, and I think with temperature rises, we're not likely to regain it. But for those of different persuasions, this is also the headquarters of the depressed river mussel in Britain, which I'm sure we can all rejoice in. Moving down from the silt fens to the peat fens, this is Wood Walton, one of the half-dozen surviving fragments of good fenland habitat. And at this point, I'll return to the Geological Society's website and point out something I don't think many of us had been aware of until the last decade or so, that the peat has come and gone several times over the last few thousand years. So the red here is sphagnum peat. And to me, you can interpret this diagram in two ways. As you rise up through the levels, you've had sphagnum, lake mud, back to sphagnum, back to reed and woodland, back to sphagnum, more lake sediments, more sphagnum. Either we can see this as marine incursions or periods of drying out, or we can take a positive view and say that sphagnum will rule in the end, that whatever environmental conditions have been thrown at it, everything short of intensive agriculture has led to a range of fen plants dominating. These days, the fens provide us with everything from reed swamp and sedge swamp to species-rich fen meadows, where the standing waters, the meres, have interest, and throughout the fens, including the arable land, the ditches have their own particular biodiversity. Cambridgeshire is the British headquarters for the European endangered spined loach, the fish at the bottom right. One of only two areas in Britain for the tansy beetle, ourselves here in the floodplain of the Great Ouse near York, and fen violet reappears from the seed bank periodically at Wickham and at Wood Walton and almost nowhere else in Britain. Moving somewhat uphill from the fen peats, we reach the boulder clay, which in terms of natural habitats, the heavier, thicker boulder clays on the tops of the hills tends to have survived as woodland when the slopes and the valley bottoms have been cultivated over many years. And wherever you get a view of the landscape in Cambridge and indeed over much of the Midlands, you will see these ancient woodlands capping the hills and supporting a remarkably rich range of wildlife. If my slide would change, I would show you a little bit of that said wildlife. While I'm waiting for the slide to appear, I should also pick up on Pamela's point that elm trees reach their ultimate diversity in Cambridgeshire. There are more elm species here probably than anywhere else on the planet. At current count, 44 of the 55 native British elms grow wild in Cambridgeshire. If my frustration is showing in my voice, it's because I am not ignoring my keypad. I am. I've not often been incapacitated by a single button, which does work occasionally, but not in any reliable way.
Let me know, Brian, if you want me to get the slides up on this end.
I think, Helen, that might be good. I'm frustrated by the system here. So can you stop me sharing rather than me having to try to do it myself?
I can.
I think you have the technology at that end.
Okay.
Fantastic. My apology, everybody. This was working yesterday, but we always say that. Fantastic. We're getting there. Thank you, Helen. And if we scroll down to the boulder clay woodlands, then I know where we're going.
Next.
Next slide, please. And next. And next. Oh, back one. Back one. One slide before that, I think. No, 2 slides before that, actually. And remember, we have meadows as well. So, Cambridgeshire boulder clay woodlands are the British oxlip woods. The oxlip, the woodland equivalent of cowslip, confined to Cambridgeshire, parts of Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire. So, one slide forward from there, and we should have the, and on the second click, we have the oxlip and the checkered skipper butterfly. I mentioned checkered skipper because Cambridge was the last place to have native English checkered skippers. And another slide on, please. And now that checkered skipper is re-established in ancient woodlands just over the border in Northamptonshire, it could be back in Cambridgeshire woodlands very soon. Next slide, please. And a click. So moving off the boulder clay onto the chalk, I should say in passing that in addition to the ancient woodlands, the boulder clay supports some of our richest ancient meadows, particularly the sort of medieval ridge and furrow sites which have been grassed over. And it's worth noting that those meadows would have been grazed as well as hay cut. And so until recently, that habitat would have had a pond in the corner of every field. Cambridgeshire would be a land of boulder clay meadows full of green-winged orchids and with a pond in every corner. 97% of the meadows have gone, and most of the surviving ones have been nutrient enriched in rainfall. Moving to the area around Cambridge City and the chalk itself, the chalk landscape you see on either side of Devil's Dyke. Back a slide if we can do. Devil's Dyke is one of 4 Saxon earthworks across what at the time of their construction was a heavily sheep ranched open landscape. So the chalk has been open ground since at least the Iron Age, with sheep grazing and some cultivation. 7th century AD, the earthworks are created and retain some of the best surviving chalk grasslands. So Devil's Dyke, internationally protected as an SAC. For the last half century, one of only 2 sites in Britain where you could see lizard orchids. They are still there, but with climate change, lizard orchids are now expanding out. Whereas pasquiflower may struggle in a changing climate, it is still thriving on a stretch of Devil's Dyke. Next slide, please, Helen. So where the chalk isn't on the surface, we find quarrying can create chalk habitats of great significance. One more click, please, Helen. This is at Cherry Hinton, famed among the locals for this animal. And if you don't recognise this animal when you see it, oddly, you may recognise it when you don't. Next click, Helen. This is a glowworm, and if you visit Cherry Hinton chalk pits on a warm summer's evening, you can see up to 60 or 70 glowing female glowworms on a wonderfully snail-rich turf. Next click, Helen. The site is also one of only half a dozen in Britain which has a large and healthy population of moon carrot, one of the rarest of the British umbellifers, confined to chalk soils here and the chalk cliffs near Dover. Next slide, please. And I shouldn't leave the chalk with actually mentioning also the chalk rivers in our area. I'm afraid these days you will not see a chalk stream full of water crowfoot appropriate for a portrait of Ophelia. These days, Ophelia would probably most of the time be lying on chalk rubble rather than in clear water, and in the surviving chalk streams, in many cases, dealing with heavily polluted watercourses. But we are fighting, and if you look on the County Council's website, the Chalk Streams project is doing sterling work restoring the remnants of what is a globally significant habitat, with 85% of the world's chalk streams being in Britain, a high proportion of those in Cambridgeshire. And my final two slides, there are places where new geology is giving us the opportunity for new habitats. This is Camborne, and at Camborne, by retaining the subsoil and creating a mound with it, we actually have a clay hillside, which I think is a new geological feature for Cambridgeshire, supporting species-rich grassland, leading down to shallow balancing lakes, another new habitat for this part of the county, with reed swamp, with willows, and fingers crossed, the final clip should show you some Camborne wildlife. So a very rich flora, including slender tear, which is a species of woodland edge and grassland edge. Bizarrely, we have a big population of breeding white-legged damselflies, normally riverine species, but thriving in the shallow lakes. Water voles have bounced back. And finally, if you've never seen one of our rarest arable plants, the broadleaf spurge, I can strongly recommend Morrison's Car Park in Camborne. Thank you very much indeed to Helen for bailing me out on the technical side. The end.
Fabulous. Thank you, Brian. What a tour de force through an immense diversity of landscapes. I'm sure some of us, most of us, have seen something in that presentation we haven't seen before. I think we've got time for a question. We'll kind of take questions as we go along, as well as if we have more time at the end. Does anyone have anything in particular they'd like to ask Brian following the presentation? Do use the raised hand if you would like to, or are you still reeling from the breadth of information, the breadth and depth of information that has been waved over your collective brains? Fabulous. Okay. Oh, Glenn, welcome. Would you like to ask your question?
Oh, sorry, it's already in the chat. It was the burbot. It was the fish that you mentioned. I thought you said turbot, and I was like, that can't be right.
Maybe the slip of the tongue. So the sole freshwater cod of Europe used to occur in the Ouse and a few of the lowland rivers. There are plans to bring it back, though the suggestion is that our rivers are now too warm and they do better to introduce it somewhere like the Lake District or southern Scotland. And then the small fish, which is a fen specialist, which is thriving, is the spined loach.
Fantastic. Great presentation. Thank you. And if there is a copy of it available, that would be amazing.
We can probably do that. I think I have permission to use all those slides.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thanks. Yeah. So we're now going to move on to more watery worlds and welcome Joe Thomas, who is going to talk about wetlands. Joe works for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and is their Waterscapes manager, and prior to that was a lead advisor for Cambridgeshire with Natural England, looking in particular at wetlands, and kind of along with, I suppose, the rest of WWT, kind of has a remit to support landowners, managers and community groups to enhance and restore and create more wetlands in Cambridgeshire, not just for biodiversity, but also for natural flood management and for all of the diverse benefits that we can get from wonderful wetlands. So, Joe, over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Pamela. I'm just going to try and share my screen. If you'll just bear with me, and hopefully,
yeah, it's looking good.
Are you seeing that?
We are.
You are. Excellent.
Well, I am anyway. So yeah.
Just 1 minute while I try to. I might have I hopefully haven't got a very big technical issue, but I can't see my notes at the moment. 1 second. Right. Okay. I'm gonna go it alone, and hopefully. Right. Okay. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be invited along here to speak today. A little bit daunting to follow Brian, I have to say, and some of the other speakers on the agenda. Thank you for the introduction, Pamela. Yeah, so I work for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, based from Welney, but covering a wider area in the Fens. And I've been asked to give 15 minutes on the value of wetlands and how to enhance and create them. So I'll move. Oh, good. So just initially talking about the value of wetlands then. Well, for the starters, they supply us with water, they can supply us with food, and they supply us with jobs working on the land, jobs through tourism from people visiting wetlands. And then, of course, we've got that built heritage and value of them as well, from structures in the landscape through to the archaeological features that are preserved in wetland peat soils. And then last but not least, obviously the biodiversity value that we can see in our wetlands and appreciate in our wetlands. This is a picture of common cranes that are doing well in Cambridgeshire these days. This is one of the big species associated with wetlands, but we mustn't forget a lot of smaller ones that are pretty insignificant, but they're feeding the food chain, and they're really important to protect those as well. So wetlands can do a lot of things for us, as well as those that have been mentioned. They can store carbon, and the world's wetlands are approximately storing a third of the world's carbon. So they're very important from that perspective. In addition to that, we know that they can help reduce flooding with healthy soils, peaty soils and healthy soils. They can act as a sponge, and then the vegetation can slow down the flow of floodwaters. So that's a really important feature of wetlands as well. And there's an increasing belief that wetlands can be incredibly good for your well-being. And the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, we're not just about ducks, we're about well-being and wildlife generally in a wetland environment. And we've done quite a lot of research on well-being and wetlands. And there's a link I can share to some reports to people that are here to sort of find out more about those benefits. And of course, restoring biodiversity to wetlands that have been perhaps damaged in the past or lost, and we need to create new ones. That's another part of what we're all interested in. So different types of wetlands in Cambridgeshire. We're incredibly fortunate to have the largest washland in the UK in the Ouse Washes, but also the Neen Washes. And both of these sites are protected as sites of special scientific interest, special protection areas for their bird populations, special area of conservation for various things, including spined loach, and a Ramsar designation as well. So these sites are internationally recognised and important. And we can see here the large gathering of swans and other wildfowl, but with the mix of habitats within these washland sites, from fen to wet grassland to wet woodland, you can see biodiversity by the bucketful here throughout all of the seasons. Not to mention the smaller Cam washes, that's also brilliant as well. So we're talking about the man-made version of habitats here. The washlands were man-made and now are used to store water and have that biodiversity value to them as well. And of course, we've got man-made reservoirs too. This is a bird's eye view of Graffham Water in Cambridgeshire, and I've put this in just to say that with reservoir sites, if we use if we landscape them properly, so if we've got beautifully graded edges, they can be really rich in aquatic plant life. The graded edges can help to prevent bank erosion, so that's a way of reducing costs in the future and keeping the costs down. And of course, these graded edges and sheltered creeks can be of brilliant value for wildfowl and other birds too. But on top of that, a reservoir like Graffham Water, it's bringing in the economy. It's bringing in some jobs to the economy. It's bringing in tourism, and we've got that added benefit of the values for wildlife as well. From one great big pond to smaller ones, you know, we have got these ponds within our landscapes that have been there for hundreds of years that support things like great crested newts, dragonflies, and a wide range of other water beetles and biodiversity. We shouldn't forget newly created ponds too, that people can do in their gardens. And all of these things in our countryside, they just act as stepping stones for our wide biodiversity to get from one place to another. So with Graffham Water being with Graffham Water being connected to the River Ouse and receiving its water from the River Ouse, I just thought I'd not say much on rivers because it's covered later, but yeah, I thought I'd pop a lovely misty early morning photo in of the River Ouse and just mention how important these wetlands are. Rivers, they're attractive for people. People love to enjoy them. The river systems themselves have got wonderful habitats within them. Brian's mentioned floodplain grasslands, wet woodlands, and new man-made habitats in the form of gravel pits, which are wonderful these days to bring in wildlife and for people to enjoy. You kind of wonder what was there before them and how much floodplain grassland has been lost, replacing with the gravel pits, but there are a biodiversity resource all the same. And the biggest thing is how the rivers, the streams, the backwaters, they all connect wildlife and habitats together. So really it's all part of this bigger, better and more joined up approach from the Northants principle that we hear a lot about. And I wanted to put this in because we talk about rivers as being connections for wildlife, but I think that ditches are underestimated myself. And with my role at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, I've spent quite a lot of time looking around ditches of late. This is one in the Fens, not far from Pymore. It's a county wildlife site for its aquatic plants. And as I say, these are actually helping to transport our special species around. And in this kind of environment, you can wander around and you see snipe, stone chats, reed buntings, and all sorts of wonderful things. So fen ditches are great in my books. Brian's already touched on fen habitats, and we're really fortunate to have, as Brian said, Woodwalton fen, home fen, and this is a picture of Wicken fen, and I've added a picture of a tansy beetle. Why Brian and I would both pick the same species when we could have picked plenty, but yeah, it's known, I think, from 3 locations across the country, 2 of which are in our local area. So these fenland sites have existed because of past historic management, traditional management practices, from the reed cutting, the sedge cutting, and low scale small peat cutting operations. And they're absolutely fundamentally important as areas where our wildlife can spread out from as we connect these beautiful biodiverse pieces of fen and our other fantastic wildlife habitats, connect them together and start to rebuild and create new habitats in between. So you know, there is an absolute need. We've got to be able to feed our nation. I'm learning lots of new things about farming all the time, and I absolutely totally appreciate the wonderful work that farmers do. But the good news is there's a few farmers that are wanting to use more regenerative forms of farming, thinking about sort of how they might be able to sort of capture carbon in the soils, in the peaty soils particularly, and reduce the escape of the carbon into the environment. And well, basically, we are there at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and lots of other people to speak to any landowners who would like to consider wetland creation in the farmed environment or elsewhere. This is a picture of what can quite easily be done in the right place with some simple techniques. And this is where some ditches have been blocked and water has been held back, and the water availability is there for most of the year, and you can start to form these pools that are incredibly beneficial for the breeding wading birds that have declined across our counties and the country over time. So if there's anyone out there that would like to think about they don't have to be large scale, they can be large scale, but they can be small scale wetland creation projects. They might even be linked to just tweaking ditch sides, so regrading the edges of ditches to give a slightly wider wetland margin to some of the farmers' fields. That can all help to make a difference and provide extra marginal habitat for plants and invertebrates. So in terms of opportunities for sort of wetland creation or restoration, well, a lot of these things depend on funding, and this Rebunting's wanting to sing about this, because we've had lottery funding for quite some time and funding from grant-making trusts, but there are some new opportunities for funding coming on stream. So we've got biodiversity net gain, and linking that to targeted improvements in coordination with local nature recovery strategies. This is an exciting time and may well produce some different funding resource for some fantastic schemes. In addition, we've heard about carbon credits and the changes to the peatland code to include lowland peat. And then there's obviously the environmental land management schemes that are coming on stream, and landscape recovery for any larger landscape scale projects. Landscape recovery offers some fabulous funding opportunities for the future. And there's a new round of that opening up soon. There's been one round and a new round of that is soon to open up. And in addition, Nature for Climate peatland grant scheme funding has been available and is available again soon. And that is including a paludiculture element for anyone that would like to try some wet farming techniques, which we haven't covered in much detail yet. There's also a paludiculture exploration fund, whereby that's looking into and investigating markets for produce, so making clothing, the stuffing for clothing out of Typha seed heads, for example, and plates and disposable plates out of Typha or reed and wet fen vegetation. And then clearly, if any farmers are able to consider some wet farming practices on their farms, then there's definitely a change of machinery maybe that's required for making sure that there's not too many high impacts on wetter soils. So there's some exploration funding there, which hopefully will get some good bids coming in. And then I've been hearing quite a lot about environmental, social and governance funding. So this is larger companies that care about what they're doing from an environmental and a social perspective. And they want to blend that within what they're doing and make sure that they're not treading too heavily on the environment in what they do. The biggest thing that I'm finding as I'm speaking to landowners in the countryside is that everyone's still requiring a lot of clarity on the layering of finance. So some of the funding streams, like countryside stewardship, might not be sufficient to cover major changes to the landscape to benefit biodiversity. It's how these different types of funding can be layered to make more of this management for biodiversity and restoration happen that's key. So I haven't got many more slides now, everybody, but it's just to put into context the important things that we need to consider when we're looking at where to restore habitats. And the science is so important. We're very, very blessed to have lots of academics and incredibly amazing botanists, people with invertebrate knowledge, and a wide range of biodiversity knowledge to help plot and map where our most important wildlife lives. In addition to that, there's evidence whereby we need to be thinking about the type of soils, the soils analysis, the water quality analysis, and the evidence to back up why we need to do something. And then most importantly, when we've actually done it, we need to be able to prove that it's having the desired effect and it is making the differences that we hope it will. I did want to say as well that, the science and what have you is changing all the time as we start to find out more about the carbon agenda. So the likes of CEH and others, I can't mention everybody, but they're all doing incredibly impressive work to help us understand the science behind carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, which is an important factor in all of this. Mapping. I wanted to say that the Fens for the Future project many years ago actually did some incredibly valuable work on wetlands and fens in particular, and they've produced some opportunity mapping and identified areas where it's best to focus some of the wetland and fenland restoration and enhancement works. And then the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust were also involved in some mapping exercises and producing some route maps. We've done something already on urban wetlands for wellbeing, which we can share with you, and that's looking at where wetlands could be positioned to actually help with the well-being and the social agenda in urban areas. So we can certainly share the experience and the research that we've done on that. And then finally, resources. We've talked about funding resources, but the bottom line is we need water. And actually, we need water to drink. The farmers need water for their crops, and these schemes also need water. So Water Resources East, the Environment Agency, the water companies, the IDBs, they're doing a lot of work in making sure that we try to plan for the water resource. And obviously it's an incredibly tricky thing to do. And but the water is absolutely vital to all of this. And just to say, we mustn't forget that we should be saving water ourselves and not just putting it onto the water companies to do. And land, we've already said about working together. You know, we haven't got massive land holdings, but collectively with any land managers that want to do and make a difference, but be it small corners of fields or larger visions, then please do speak to us at the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust and other partners, and we'll happily share the knowledge that we've got. And interestingly, it's a two-way thing for me. I've learned so much on drainage from local farmers that if we cross-fertilise our knowledge base widely, to benefit everybody, then that can only be a win-win situation. And it's just really to just focus again on the partnerships and collaboration. I've focused on a Project Godwit success story, which really has helped to keep black-tailed godwits breeding as a breeding bird in Cambridgeshire. And with collaboration and funding from a wide range of sources, various organisations have managed to collect eggs under licence from nests that were going to be destroyed and flooded, or perhaps damaged through man-made practices. And the eggs have been hatched, and then these birds have been looked after. It's called head starting, released onto the ooze washes and the neem washes. And from a population of 3 pairs on the ooze washes, which were actually off the ooze washes because the ooze washes flooding was too deep, we've recently got that up to 18 pairs, but there's still a lot more work to do. You have to collaborate on these things to make an absolute success of them. So yeah, that's kind of a whistle-stop tour from me. I hope I've not run over. I did lose all my notes, so I've done that completely from my brain cells, which don't operate too well these days. But yeah, just to say, my details are on the screen here. We'd love to speak to anyone that's interested in wetland creation, restoration, or enhancement. And actually, if anyone is interested in looking at what we've done and what other people are doing locally in the Fens, we'd be happy to set up a site visit to Lady Fen and elsewhere and share the knowledge that we've gleaned, if that would suit people in the audience and others that we know. So thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jo. That was great. And I think the wonder of wetlands is that, you know, at almost any scale, you know, from a washing up bowl pond right through to the ooze washes, you know, build it and they will come. So that's a fabulous offer as well. Potentially we'll have a partnership forum away day looking at wetlands. That sounds brilliant. I think we won't take wetlands questions now because we've got Riverscapes to follow. So perhaps if we kind of have a wetland and rivers Q&A after we've had our Riverscapes talk, because I suspect that Neil, from his interest in trees and in his latest blog as well, that there might be some sort of river related work there too. So thank you very much. That's brilliant. So I wonder if we could move on to our next speaker, who is Neil Jarvis from the Forestry Commission. He is the Partnership Advisor for the East and East Midlands, and if you wish to look him up and stalk him online, he's written a rather excellent blog on making space for nature in terms of trees and to benefit water, and some rather fine comments about trees in relation to flood risk management, in relation to water retention and kind of the usefulness of trees. But, you know, beyond that, I'm sure he will tell us more about trees and woodlands in the landscape. So 15 minutes, and then I thought we might just take a quick 5-minute break after we've had this talk and any questions, and then we'll move on to our final 2 talks. Brilliant. Thank you. Go ahead, Neil.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, good morning, everyone. Yes, as I say, I work for the Forestry Commission, and I'd like to talk to you today about trees and woodlands in the landscape, particularly the Cambridgeshire landscape. So next slide, please. So this first slide is perhaps a romantic image of a rural landscape. However, it is a landscape I was familiar with as a boy working on farms in Norfolk, and familiar with that style of tractor as well, which is long gone, I dare say. But I also wanted to get across the fact that, yes, the Forestry Commission wants to, we are being promoted by the government to plant more woodland, but woodland as a function for biodiversity doesn't need to be vast expanses of woodland. This is a treed landscape, small copse of trees, hedgerows full of trees and corners, and perhaps riparian shelter belts I'll come on to. They create, in effect, like an open woodland. And as we know, woodland is extremely important for biodiversity. I think when I studied ecology 30 odd years ago, I was told that the associated insects and other fauna associated with native broadleaf trees, I think oak was about 150 associated species, is now over 300. Silver birch now sort of come to the fore as being very important for biodiversity in the associated species. So it can be taken that, and as the professor said earlier, woodlands, particularly ancient woodlands, are very high biodiversity. But a treed landscape is also very important. So next slide, please. Right, yes, I wanted to go sort of launch straight into the benefits of woodland, but I also wanted to really illustrate woodland in the Cambridgeshire landscape and in relation to carbon sequestration, the capture of carbon. As you see there, out front there is fen on deep peat, which we've talked about, absolutely essential for carbon capture, particularly for the county of Norfolk on those deep peat soils. I also want to mention that I tune into lots of different partnership meetings, and I have heard various other claims made. I do not know where they come from. I heard recently somebody say that salt marsh was more important for carbon capture than the Amazon rainforest. Now, where does this come from? I don't know if it's journalists getting the wrong end of the stick or new social media. Anyway, you can see there, this is the science produced by Natural England very recently, and you can see that deep peat is the most important. And that means for the Forestry Commission, when we are in negotiation with landowners and they're wanting incentive, a grant for woodland creation, we look in great detail at what's on the site, whether there's ground nesting birds, waders, historical features, and peat soils, particularly in Cambridgeshire, for us are a no-go area. We do not give an incentive for planting on deep peat. Having said all that, as you can see, native broadleaf woodland is a close runner-up in woodland capture. And I believe as Joe was saying, that the science is still being worked on, because as I understand it, woodlands and trees and woodland soils may be capturing more carbon than some of the early maths suggested. So that's, the science is still improving on that. So hopefully that gets across the importance of Cambridgeshire for carbon capture in their soils. Next slide, please. Helen, can we have the next slide?
Yeah, slight technical issue.
Okay. Yeah. It was going to be worse from this end, so that's why I put the responsibility to you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, great success on the technical side of things today. I am pressing the next slide button, but nothing seems to be happening. Oh.
Right. So I want to talk about sort of the functions of trees in the landscape, and that the tree root mass is very important, and the relationship between trees and water. that root mass going down into the soil and the subsoil helps infiltration and stores water underground. Oh, can we go back one? We'll come on to that in a minute. Yeah, so thank you. So trees are very important in flood events to sort of mitigate the effect of flood events, which, as we're finding, of course, we're getting more extremes of weather, aren't we? We're getting droughts, we're getting floods. We're not getting the desperate floods that maybe in northwest England where the whole towns are flooded, but a flood event can be very, very significant for arable soils. It can actually make the growing season greatly reduced for the local farmer. And as we know, farm products in Cambridgeshire are very important. So trees can be used to mitigate that. The soils themselves and the high organic content help reduce the runoff. So it acts as a sponge effect. I use the tree with the tree root mass there for illustrative purposes, and somebody pointed out to me that root mass isn't as big as that in reality. Well, no, particularly on shallow soils, but trees on chalk. But the root mass that is visible will be much smaller than that. But there is a halo around the visible roots, which are so important for the relationship between trees and soils. So that's purely for illustrative purposes, that the visible roots usually aren't that big, but the tiny microscopic ones certainly are much more extensive. So next slide, please.
Sorry, same issue, pressing button.
Gives me a chance to sort of gather my thoughts.
Oops.
As I mentioned, the sponge effect is the overall effect that, hence SpongeBob SquarePants there. So how trees are using water. A broadleaf woodland canopy typically intercepts up to 40% of the rainfall. So you've got this sponge above ground, and on a bright and breezy summer's day, they're pumping out water 265 litres per day, and it's evapotranspiration. That does mean, again, where you site trees and new woodlands is very important, because if you've got a problem of soil moisture deficits on free draining soils, then you may not want a very large woodland. But in Cambridgeshire, on the heavier soils, they can be extremely useful to, as I say, to mitigate heavy rainfall periods. So you've got this sponge effect above ground and below ground, because the root mass improves soil porosity after up to 55%. I did do some research to say, well, does that mean that they also help groundwater recharge? And after a lot of research and talking to hydrologists, etc., it's not as simple as that. It can actually help recharge groundwater, but groundwater has various levels to it, and you can get suspended groundwater, etc. So, and also the budget, what's going in down and what's being pumped out, is quite complicated. And that does mean that if the Forestry Commission in East England were to get a landowner who wanted to plant a very large woodland, we would then research and talk to the Environment Agency, is that going to affect groundwater resources? So next slide, please. So trees preventing floods. Trees' roots stabilize and protect the soil from erosion. And that stops that topsoil going into the watercourse. So the drainage, the carrying capacity of the drainage networks is improved, and it reduces accumulation of sediments. And as I've often said to farmers, that may mean that you have to spend less time and money digging out your drains. It maintains a good drainage network with good capacity. And as I say, we've seen that woodlands use water and they take it up, store it, they store it within their tissues, and is evapotranspiration through the leaves. And with the woodland floor, the branches and leaves it's known as surface roughness. Basically, any flow of water through that is slowed down and storing the flood. Very important in what we call natural flood management. So next slide, please. So here's a good example of a relatively small wooden planting scheme, where you can see the drain, the open drain running on the right-hand side, how it's eroded away both sides of the bank. So the small area of planting has stabilized the bank on that side. And then you've got top left, you've got a main road with water coming off the main road, and that steep slope has been planted. And again, those trees will slow that flow. They'll also stop a lot of the materials coming off the road, diesel and oil, from getting into the drain. And so overall, a small scheme like that can help mitigate and control the drainage system. If that field at the top there was deep peat, that's not where we'd be planting trees. Interestingly, in my research, I've also found that for peat to function to capture atmospheric carbon, it must be wetted, but not inundated for too long a period. If it's inundated and has a surface covering of water, you can actually start to get peat breakdown and releasing methane, which is, of course, in the atmosphere is even worse than carbon dioxide. So I think by placing a small woodland in the right place, holding back a flood, or could actually be used to control water levels to the right effect for the health of the peat. But then siting would be very important. Next slide, please.
Apologies, same issue.
I'm so glad I didn't have to do this. I'm sure I'd be even slower. Right. I'm now talking about trees and water quality. What affects water quality? Well, throughout East Anglia, and that includes Cambridgeshire, of course, nitrates and phosphates in rivers are a real problem. They're coming from industrial sources, off roads, domestic sources, and of course, fertilizers, organic and inorganic fertilizers. When those materials get into watercourses and drainage networks, they cause algal blooms, particularly in the summertime. The water becomes turbid, you get less light penetration and deoxygenation of the water, causing large fish deaths. And it happens quite frequently now. And also spray drift going into drains and streams can cause problems for aquatic life. How can trees help in that situation? Let's see. Next slide, please. Same things going on, the same functions of sort of water retention and the water budget. The root mass and the trees themselves can actually act as a physical barrier. They'll stop the surface runoff, they'll stop the sediments from getting into a drain, and they'll take up the water, and they do also take up the materials within that water. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see how that operates. Riverside shelter belts. They are providing this physical barrier through the root mass and the roughness of the surface and the soils. So they're physically, sorry, can we go back one? So they're physically stopping whatever's in the water from getting into a stream, those various pollutants. There you up. Forward one. Right, good. But they're also working as a biological barrier. The root mass itself will absorb the nutrients, phosphates and nitrates, and they'll biologically break them down and use them for their own growth, again, preventing those materials getting into a watercourse. Next slide, please. I was once asked, well, that's all very well, but where's the evidence for that? So these buffer strips that can prevent pollutants getting into water, it has been widely researched. If you see just quite narrow buffer strips can help with this biological process called denitrification to break down chemicals. Although these names may not sound terribly English, may I say, the research has been done in this country. The one Borin researching buffer strips, that was in Denmark with very similar agricultural systems and quite some similar landscapes. So the evidence is there that relatively small woodlands, as I say, that a treed landscape can help in, and the relationship that the trees and shelter belts have with water can help stop the problems of pollution. Next slide, please. Tree shelter belts to absorb aerial pollutants. I researched this because of, it's known that Cambridgeshire and the other East England counties have a large agricultural operations for poultry and pigs producing ammonia, which could cause problems as well, atmospheric pollution. Now, design of a woodland to prevent or to absorb ammonia in the atmosphere is slightly different. Again, they're shelter belts, but what they're trying, the diagram is trying to show here, by having parallel shelter belts, you get this, the wind blowing over one and descends down and then pushes the air from the pig or poultry unit up into the canopy of the other, on the other side. And the scientists show this does actually work. And so the tree canopy can absorb the ammonia and it breaks it down, and then that's trapped in the woodland soils. And again, the research has been done in this country. So there's a question that's come up that I can't see my next bit there. So yes. So riparian, yes, well, let's come on to the next slide, please. Sorry. So this is an overall view of a sort of wooded landscape in a drainage system. So you can have wider catchment woodlands. Obviously, the cross slopes, they're the woodlands that can intercept the surface runoff and trap sediments. The riparian woodlands can maintain bank sides from erosion, and a floodplain woodland can be one of these natural flood management schemes, can hold back a flood event, but obviously they need to be positioned in a very to be targeted within a drainage network very carefully. So the Forestry Commission would work with landowner and environment agency to put that in the right place, because you don't want to cause problems further upstream, but they can be very useful to, as I say, mitigate flood problems. Next slide, please. So this is an overall diagram, just to sort of go through everything that I've just covered about the absorption of ammonia, spray drift, and sediments runoff, and how trees can then absorb and absorb nutrients, stabilize the soil. That's the total functioning within a sort of a wet landscape. Next slide, please. So yes, to recap then, I think it's well known that woodlands, once they become established and are managed and have a diversity of species, they can become very important for biodiversity. And also targeting woodland creation, perhaps linking to ancient woodlands, allows for mobile species, birds, insects, etc., and small mammals to move about between, so that locating new woodlands between ancient woodlands can be very, very important for biodiversity. We've seen that carbon capture is very important for woodlands can do that, woodland soils can do that, peat soils do it better, So we need to target where we put new woodlands. And as I've gone into some detail, the improvement of water quality, very important in Eastern County, and natural flood management, instead of using hard features in the landscape, woodlands creation or existing woodlands can help with natural flood management. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you, Neil. I love the concept of happy fish that you had in your diagram. Perhaps we might hear a little more about that in the Riverscapes conversation when Craig joins. Craig, welcome. So I see we've got a hand up from Stephen. Stephen, do you have a question for Neil? No, we have a question from Robert, though. So perhaps we'll just take Robert's question, then Stephen, if you want to tell me. I was just going to take two questions here.
Good. I'm okay now.
Okay, Stephen, you go ahead, and then we, Robert.
I just wanted to say thank you to Neil for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask him if there were downsides of riparian tree planting that you wanted to mention. I say this because for two reasons. The Cam River manager says that trees very close to the river are really difficult to manage when they're old. And there are obviously times when trees do fall over into rivers, etc. And secondly, the shading of rivers is quite an important problem, I think, sometimes if there are too many trees by the water, and streams do need good lighting.
Yes, yes to all of that. Yes, mine was very much an overview. When it actually comes down to cases, as it were, where the Forestry Commission is involved, it's usually a woodland officer or woodland creation officer providing advice. That advice will be very bespoke, and the site visit is essential because, as you say, trees very close to a river can cause problems for river management. So the actual design of a new woodland creation scheme it would be very important, and we would work with the Environment Agency. I've done it myself years ago. How sometimes you may have to leave enough work for the engineering or the clearing of the river, so the trees may have to be not hard up against the bank, or maybe some can, but also having other access. So the design is very bespoke to the site itself. Trees in rivers can be a problem, particularly for navigation, but they can also be, again, it's where it happens, because trees are sometimes now being left in rivers because they actually modify the flow. On the Little Ouse at the moment, down at Santon Downham, there's one or two trees have been left because it causes the flow to change, so we get erosion of the bed mainly, revealing the gravels for fish to spawn in, but also we get sedimentation sort of on the other side, which can be important as well for other species, snails, etc. So yes, I think your last question was about rivers and shading. Of course, there's also the concept of keeping rivers cool, because we're finding with warmer weather, and particularly sort of very hot periods, the river waters get very warm. The oxygen content, the oxygen tension as it's called, is reduced, so we get large fish kills. Again, the design would be very specific to a site. If there's a large stretch of very open river channel, then maybe shading would be very important. But yes, but also where woodlands pass through a treed landscape which has got a lot of shading, again, the woodland officer would probably not advise further planting there. Yeah. So all of those things are considered in the design.
Brilliant, thank you. And running up, of course, against, we always have these wonderful selection talks. We're slightly running up against time, but there was a question from Robert in the chat about how effective are woodland strips as barriers to pollution and also to airborne pollution. And Tim, you had a question as well. I'm not sure if your question aligns with that or whether it's a different question. Do you want to just say it briefly, and then we'll see if Neil can scoop up an answer?
I would only comment the fact that my farm was planted up 120 years ago with woodland trees along riparian routes. It does create a bit of a problem from a shading point of view, I think, but there's no doubt about it that it's very effective for intercepting runoff. And I can quite see that if you had a slight barrier from a woodland management point of view alongside the river itself, it would make it easier to actually take trees out. But actually, we've left our fallen trees because of this business of slowing water down, rightly or wrongly.
Okay, so just briefly, Neil, if there's anything you want to say about barriers to pollution from major highways.
Yeah, I always try and, well, I do research. I rely upon the science, and that's why there's one or two slides which mentions research done with regards to nitrates and phosphates coming off arable soils. I haven't seen reliable research on what are the effects of woodland creation next to roads that may be, so obviously it's going to be salt, oil, diesel, and also, as I understand it, the rubber from tires produces various chemicals that can get into watercourses. I will research it, but I won't give a statement without backing it up. I would like to think that they will certainly help trap those sorts of materials, but as I say, I don't know because I haven't seen the science on that. It's quite difficult to find reliable science papers on them, but yes, I will endeavour to do so.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And I just thought, because it has been requested that we have a short comfort break, it's 10:47. It would be quite good, I wonder if we disable some sort of screen sharing there, whether we have a quick break and we're back in 3 minutes time at 10:50, when we will have a talk about grasslands followed by a talk about riverscapes, both 50 minutes talk, and then we'll have Mike Maunder summarising this delight that we've all been experiencing this morning. So 3 minutes and back at 11:50.
Okay.
Hello, Pamela. You there?
I think
I am
Pamela.
here. I am
Oh,
here.
Pamela, you can see my slides now, can you?
I can, yeah, definitely.
Excellent, that's great. I wanted to make sure they're up and ready to go. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, they are fantastic.
That's excellent. Thanks, Pamela. Just wanted to check. You can see the lovely hair.
It's fabulous. I was at Wandlebury last week and there were 5 hares in.
Oh, there were. Yes, they're all out now.
Just fabulous. Herring around.
They're all coming out now. Yes, I know, it's lovely.
Yeah.
Yes, we have the meadows near us. They've got hares in now. It's really nice.
Yeah. So we had the treat. We went to see the belted galloways, which are newly arrived.
Oh, yes, they've just gone to Wandlebury, haven't they? Yes, that's right.
Complementing the 2 rather ancient highlands.
Yes, I know those. I feel sympathy with those, mind you.
Yeah.
Just wanted
like myself, but
it's Martin Hassel here. Just wanted to highlight, based upon the last session there, that I just found a study from the University of Surrey, I think, on planting hedges to combat near road pollution exposure. I haven't researched it or anything like that to see whether it's well regarded or not, but it does look like planting hedges along roadsides does stop pollution.
Excellent. You would think there would be that it would.
I posted it on the chat. So.
Brilliant, thank you.
It's interesting, that question, though, because funnily enough, some of that pollution actually aids certain plants. It's really odd. Cow parsley, for example, loves rich nutrient verges. Very interesting how the complexities of these things come. So that glorious display that we often have at the end of May of Queen Anne's lace is often encouraged, in fact, by increased pollution. Quite interesting.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this side of things is that you just immediately think that any kind of development or whatever is bad. But there are, I think what I'm sort of picking up is the need for diversity. So it's these monocultures of field upon field of one thing that seems to be more damaging. Whereas, if you dig a gravel pit, actually that might be catastrophic for a period, but then after that it creates a lot of biodiversity. And I think that's, I guess, as a general trend, that's what I'm hearing for farmers and landowners, is to try and diversify as much as possible.
Exactly. I think the big key to it all is patchiness. Always have patchiness.
Habitat mosaics, right?
Exactly.
Yes, right.
I think we are about to start. That was always our mantra in the uplands. When anybody got upset about anything that anybody wanted to do, we always said habitat mosaics.
Exactly.
Which is the solution that is also a bit of a non-solution, but brilliant. So hopefully everyone is back with us again. So we're about to start a talk on Cambridgeshire grasslands by a Professor Philip Stott, who is Professor Emeritus at SOAS, a biogeographer, writer, broadcaster. Has written about chalk grasslands and their conservation and management in Kent and also in Cambridgeshire. So over to you, Philip. And
thank you very much, Pamela.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. I'm also learning a lot. It's one of the great advantages of this. You're going to learn a lot from each of the different speakers and contributions. Wonderful. So Cambridgeshire grasslands, yes, a very important topic. Let's start very simply then with types of grassland that we've got in Cambridgeshire. Now, Brian, right at the start, en passant, mentioned, of course, that we do have some limestone grassland. Very important, Oolitic limestone grassland, the Barnock Hills and Holes near Peterborough. National Nature Reserve, of course, extremely important, and I'll be mentioning that a little bit later on. He also mentioned that we do have good chalk grassland in Cambridge, very intriguing ones. He showed us a lovely picture of the Cherry Hinton chalk pits in CB1, of course, and that's a BCN site. We've got Wandleborough, of course, where you were, I think, Pamela, looking at the belted cattle that have just come there, the country park there, etc. And that's, of course, a charity, Cambridge Past, Present and Future, etc. So we've got two very good bits of limestone and chalk grassland, including the dikes as well. So they're two very important habitats. We then have a very wide range of calcareous to neutral lowland grasslands, often on boulder clay or other glacial deposits that, again, Brian mentioned at the beginning, both wet and dry, both riverine grasslands and dry ones. And there are many examples, of course, some in the urban areas. There's Upwood Meadows near Ramsey, for example, a BCN one, Trumpington Meadows near where I live, BCN again, and Hobson Park, of course, Great Nayton, a country park, all rather new in many ways, some of those, and very important habitat indeed. One just has to think of the glorious displays of Primula viris of the cowslip that you're going to get on those wonderful, wonderful meadows. Then more rarely, of course, we have neutral to acid lowland grassland in Cambridge. We do have some, not as much as we do have the calcareous to neutral, which stand ground wash, for example, Peterborough, again, the Wildlife Trust. Very interesting, fascinating habitat. Very interesting because, of course, it actually has a lichen habitat, enormously rare in the Cambridgeshire context. But then more widely, we have urban meadows, of course, of one another, hedge banks, verges, lawns, parks, gardens, everything from Sheep's Green to Cofen, City Council LNRs, Anglesey Abbey with its various grasslands, the roads throughout the county, general green spaces and fields. So it's a very, very varied situation when we come to the types of grassland. But there are certain principles that apply to all our grasslands, and especially in Cambridgeshire. Now, the thing we all know is that all grasslands need management. Very simply, they're all subclimaxes, sterile communities. What that means, of course, they're less than normally we would have under the climate. They're not climatic climax vegetation for our areas. They're also what we call plagioclimaxes, that they're deflected climaxes, deflected perhaps by grazing, by cutting, by haymaking, you name it, they're deflected. And to maintain the biodiversity of a grassland, therefore, management is absolutely crucial. And management needs to involve many things. It can involve grazing, of course, sheep, cattle, ponies, rabbits, you name it, mowing, scything, haymaking. Trampling can be very important under certain circumstances, and often the physical removal of invading woody species, because of course the vegetation is always wanting to move towards its climax. That's what it's wanting to do. That's what it's hoping to do. And we've also had a lot about nutrients. And what is interesting about most grasslands is their biodiversity depends largely on maintaining low nutrient status. Where you have high nutrients, it means that one or two species who can utilize that extra nutrient base become dominant and oust the overall biodiversity. This is especially true of the oolitic limestone and the chalk grassland. They depend largely on low nutrient status. So anything affects that low nutrient status can be a problem for maintaining biodiversity. There's then flood and water management, of course, and very much so the special protection that is often needed for rare species. We've had the mention of the moon carrot, Cessula libanotis, already. Orchids inevitably, but it's not just those, it's things like cowslips which people want to collect. As of old, we've got to remember that even into the 1940s, village women would collect armfuls of cowslips for garlands, for cowslip tea, for cowslip cordial. That tendency is still there. There's also vandalism, of course, in relation to it as well, quite different. Things like the parsfly and, of course, many butterflies. So the management is rather crucial. And what it means is that each grassland patch, however small or however large, has to have a specific type and precise management system. It needs a grazing regime, time of cutting, take into account public pressure and the management of surrounding landscapes. So the thing with grasslands, to maintain your biodiversity, depends on very strong, well-run and researched management. Now, as you and I were just discussing, Pamela, one of the best things of all in terms of management of grassland, increasing the biodiversity, is the patch management of the grassland. And where the grassland site is large enough, maximum biodiversity will be maintained by maintaining overall patches. Thus, you will have a prime grassland area often, but you will also need within it bare patches, disturbed ground, unstable ground, for example, chalk and limestone scree. You'll need areas of coarser grassland, you'll need scrubland, and you will need wooded margins. And it's when you have all that patchiness in relation to a grassland that you get enormous biodiversity, not just of the grassland, but of the area as a whole. And this benefits a whole range of plants and mammals, insects, etc., some of whom like marginal habitats. They love the marginal habitat that a grassland can create, for example, with a scrubland and a woodland. And it means that fauna and flora can also migrate between vegetation types, which also helps to maintain the management. So patch management of grasslands is absolutely vital. Now, unfortunately, in Cambridge, we have some very difficult threats to grasslands above all. All our vegetation, as we've seen from the other speakers, have got problems, but grassland is very much under threat, partly because in many areas there is no proper management scheme. And that means they are going to change. The biodiversity will fundamentally be lost. There are new problems of flooding and drought relating to the last speaker. There are also too much public pressure on small isolated sites, which is a problem that needs direct control. We've also got an increasing problem with the change of climate with summer wildfires, and particularly, unfortunately, with both deliberate and accidental fires, the curse of the disposable barbecue. An absolute nightmare, I'm afraid, in terms of our habitats. We then have direct picking and collecting, as I've mentioned, of rare plants, cowslips being a particular case in point. There is industrial dumping and pollution and local dumping because grasslands are so easy to do the dumping on. So that's why they're often very much in the firing line. And often this is nutrient-rich waste, again, which is a problem. We have direct ploughing up of areas. We also have some countryside pursuits that are highly damaging to grasslands, motocross and other things. And we have, of course, illegal activity such as hare coursing. because of course it is our meadows and our grasslands that are the home of the brown hare. So we have many things that need controlling. But also, in terms of our development of the new Cambridge, grasslands are especially under threat from infrastructural development. They're always the first in the line for potential development sites. Biomedical campuses, railway stations, housing for growing population, student accommodation, solar panel farms, you name it. Grasslands are often right there at the center of the attack. So let's just highlight, to come to an end on all this, that we do have some wonderful sites. Let's go back to first of all, the Oolitic limestone, Barnock Hills and Holes, 50 acres, quite a large site relatively, under the National Nature Reserve. Medieval quarries that have helped to produce this landscape, very important, and 50% of all the limestone grasslands in Cambridgeshire occur in Barnock Hills and Holes. So very, very important. 8 orchid species, passflower, clustered bellflower, wonderful site for the knapweed broomrape, a rare plant, of course, but management here is very important. It's carried on by about approximately 300 sheep plus rabbits. So you've got a management plan maintaining this extremely important habitat. Likewise, mentioned by Brian, Cherry Hinton chalk pits, local nature reserve, 11 hectares, very much smaller. Chalk scree, good because it has enormous patchiness, which help its diversity. And as I think Brian hinted, one of only 6 extant sites in Britain for the moon carrot, Thesla libonotus. And luckily, the numbers are indeed increasing at this site, though they have gone down at other sites where it occurred in the Gog Magog, for example, which is a pity. It has a full chalk grassland flora, and again, those glowworms that were mentioned, and 60 bird species. Because of it being a very patchy site with all sorts of it's a very rich habitat again for maintaining a rich fauna and flora. But some less obvious ones. Trumpington Meadows Local Nature Reserve, 58 hectares, split of course by the M11, famous for its wonderful Saxon settlement, famous also for the coprolite pits that we mentioned in earlier, that John Stevens Henslow actually had helped to discover and found the British phosphate industry. But of course, famous for its hares, its skylarks, meadow pivets, yellowhammers, grass snakes, you name it. A lot of research, very, very important. A rich meadow flora with an absolutely unmatched spring display of cowslips. Quite spectacular. And this is managed by grazing and hay cutting, but of course it's now impinged on by new development, which is very close to it, and which is going to therefore need great care in looking at the new pressures that are going to occur on that particular local nature reserve. And then as an opposite one, Stanground Wash Local Nature Reserve, a small one, 26 hectares. This is the rare habitat of acidic grassland, dominated, I said, occasionally, quite remarkably, by lichens, a very unusual habitat for Cambridgeshire, rare habitat. But again, rich with skylarks, very rich bird life. Mown, grazed by cattle, does need direct control here, particularly of invasive thistles. So this is one where you actually need direct control of the grassland. So let's just bring this little talk on grasslands to a close. They are a fascinating range of habitats of grasslands in Cambridgeshire. And just to pick up the comment that was made very well by Joe in terms of gardens, of course, if you're opening up wild meadows in your gardens, if you're having wild areas in your gardens, you are going to increase this supply of grasslands in the whole area. And they're so important to the patchiness of the whole of the landscape. But they're not that easy to maintain. They do need very careful management. And that is one of the big problems here in Cambridgeshire. Because grasslands are a crucial part in the habitat maintaining the overall patchiness of the Cambridge landscape. So thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful. A tour de force as ever. Thank you, Philip. I have a quick question from Marcelo, who's the Nature Recovery Network coordinator for Cambridge.
Oh, yes.
He wonders what type of grassland is best for connectivity, if any?
Oh, a linear grassland is obviously very, very important. Yes, the answers are very straightforward. In fact, the maintenance of linear habitats is absolute. When we talk about patchiness, we're not just talking about squares and rectangles and triangles. Linear habitats are absolutely crucial. So grasslands linked with hedgerows, which have a linear effect, which allow, of course, fauna and flora to migrate. This is what is absolutely essential, that we also have, and built in all this, a whole series of linear habitats along roadside, which need the proper management. We need councils not to cut them at the wrong time. We need councils to let the plants grow to seed, to spread, etc. We have to have the timing on these linear habitats. I think that's the big answer, not just for grasslands, but for a whole series of habitats, including hedgerows and that lovely treed landscape that Neil mentioned.
Brilliant. So he just clarifies, not a specific type is good, it's more about the placement in the landscape.
The more types, the better. Obviously, we're lucky because we have the geological variation, but that's a bit difficult to replicate because that geological replication is where it is. We're not going to be able to shift the Ulitic limestone ones, for example. But as long as we're maintaining grasslands with a rich variety of plants in them, which on linear basis is going to be tremendously helpful to wildlife.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Philip. That was wonderful. Now, and if anyone hasn't been to Barnock Hills and Holes, it is so hilly and holy, and I know that's kind of obvious, but do go there. It's astonishing as a landscape. I thoroughly recommend it, and it's a very short way off the A1 should you be progressing north for any reason. So brilliant. Right.
And what we should just mention, I think what we should just mention is, of course, it's the source of the stone for so much of the very few stone buildings that Anglo-Saxons built. Because, of course, the material was timber, but they did build from Barnock Hills and Holes those wonderful buildings which have that wonderful colour of the Barnock Hills stone.
Brilliant. And I think I've just seen a question coming from Matthew, but I think I will just hold that for the moment, because actually we need to move on to our next speaker, and then we'll see how much time we've got.
I'll stop sharing now.
Brilliant. If you stop sharing, and then we move on to.
I've lost my.
That's okay. So we're moving on now to.
Yeah, we're done.
Moving on now to welcome to Craig Bennett, Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust, also known as the Royal Society of Wildlife Trust, which is the central body connecting all of the wildlife trusts throughout the country. He's been sort of joined as Chief Executive in April 2020. Not much was happening around that time that was different. So he had an interesting beginning to that life. And I'm sure many of you know that before then he was Chief Executive of the Friends of the Earth, and a wonderful campaigner for nature and for climate, and was formerly a director of the university's Sustainability Institute and remains as an associate. So Riverscapes, the floor is yours, Craig.
All right, Pamela, thank you very much, and very nice to see you and to see Brian Eversham and to see many other familiar faces and names on this call. I have to say I feel a bit of an interloper today in a way, because in my role as a national role for the Wildlife Trust, I don't get involved in local issues really. And I'm not today, really. I just want to sort of plant a few thoughts and ideas and ask a few questions today, because, of course, the local remit of the Wildlife Trust is very much Brian Eversham and Wildlife Trust of Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire, and other wonderful trusts in this region as well. But I do happen to live in Cambridge, and so this is my part of the world, and I care a lot about Cambridgeshire and about the east of England. And I'm also, I suppose I should declare for the purposes of this meeting as well, I'm also, in my personal capacity, I'm chair of the Independent Challenge Group for Anglian Water as well, which is the customer challenge group for the Anglian Water region. And so I'm very, very interested in rivers, strangely enough. And I just want to sort of float an idea or two today that I think in this region, in the east of England generally, is worth us kind of thinking about. Obviously, you'll be familiar with the Wildlife Trusts, and Peter, I have to say, Peter's very kindly been trying to encourage me to join one of these meetings for a long time, and I've always wanted to, never been able to. So I'm really just coming along today to join you and be part of this conversation. It's a real pleasure. But I mean, obviously, you'll be aware of the Wildlife Trusts and the local work we do of local trusts. Over the last couple of years, and actually during the pandemic, we produced for the first time really a strategy for the Wildlife Trusts about saying what we want to try and deliver together. And we're doing a lot of thinking, and there's a particular role for me and the central team in helping convening trusts to have kind of joined up conversations at a regional level, or indeed across the UK as well, as to what we can try and deliver together, and working with other partners as well. And it won't surprise you that of the three strategic goals in our strategy, what we want to see differently in 2030, and this strategy is all online, by the way, one of those goals is that we want to see nature in recovery with abundant and diverse wildlife and natural processes creating wilder land. We also want to see nature playing a valued central role in helping us solve local and global problems, whether that's climate change, whether it's improving people's physical and mental well-being, whether it's pollution control, and so on. And by the way, the other goal is that we want to see people taking action at community level to enable those things to happen. And of course, we've been doing lots over many years, individual trusts been doing lots over many years as to see how we can try and do that bigger, better, more joined up nature that we're all very familiar with, I'm sure. And I'm sure you'll recognise that this is the wonderful Great Fen project of Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northants Wildlife Trust up in northern Cambridgeshire. An absolutely fabulous project example about how wildlife trusts have been doing landscape recovery at the landscape scale. And of course, in Cambridgeshire, we're very lucky not only to have the Great Fen, but also the very exciting plans for Wicken Fen and so on. So there's a lot of work and thinking I know has already been done about restoring our lowland peatlands at scale. And just wonderful to see this wetter landscape kind of emerging that we've been seeing. But I want to talk a little bit today, just a little bit about rivers and where we're going kind of as a country perhaps, but particularly as the east of England, on what you might call riverscapes. Again, I can give loads of examples across the wildlife trusts, and there have been many other organisations as well that are doing fantastic work to try and renaturalise, re-wiggle, however you want to put it, rewild, or even just free our rivers. This is a brilliant project by Staffordshire Wildlife Trust. And for a long time, the Trent, right in the middle of Stoke-on-Trent, was stuck in a concrete channel. And if you knew it, it went right under the old Victoria ground, which was the Stoke City ground, and it was trapped under there. And when Stoke City moved out of the centre of Stoke, then Staffordshire Wildlife Trust worked with developers to free the river, if you like, and to renaturalise the riverscape. And obviously new houses built on this as well. But this is now, I need to get updated photos of this, but my understanding this has worked very effectively in creating this beautiful new, much more naturalised riverscape right in the centre of Stoke-on-Trent, which of course is very important for local community as well as wildlife as well. It's worth saying Scottish Wildlife Trusts have had a project for the last few years called Riverwoods, which has been particularly looking about how they can create a sort of thriving network of riverbank woodlands in various parts of Scotland. And it's interesting, one of the key reasons for this, which actually Neil was alluding to just when I came on the call, is about creating the shading that's needed to ensure healthy fish and abundant fish populations in some of the Scottish rivers that otherwise, without the cooling effect of the shading of riverwoods, there would be a real risk to some of the fish populations there. So there's a range of phenomenal projects going on. Of course, you'll be aware in this region, Essex Wildlife Trust, Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and others have been working hard at trying to restore our salt marshes, seagrasses, and so on at the other end of the rivers. And of course, also wildlife trusts and other organisations have been instrumental in bringing certain species back to our rivers and done a lot of work in trying to reintroduce beavers. We've now got beavers in enclosures in several parts of the country, from Cornwall to Devon to Derbyshire and many other places in between. And we're obviously hoping for the permission for the wild releases any point soon. We keep kind of pushing that, and we're desperately hoping to do it. And of course, as you'll all know, the fantastic role that beavers play as ecosystem engineers. What I find extraordinary when I visit these sites is just it's a very different landscape from other parts of the UK without beavers. You know, you kind of find yourself thinking when beavers were abundant across the British Isles, it would have been a very, very different landscape to what it is now. And the huge importance that beavers can play in creating wetlands, and doing that as part of sort of functioning river systems will be very, very important. And let's hope that that can happen at scale sometime soon. But what I wanted to do is just kind of, particularly because my job in the Wildlife Trust is very much to sort of think beyond the county level and think how we can have really big projects. If you don't know, to take a quick departure from rivers for a second, you might have heard that last month we were very, very pleased to announce a deal with Aviva, which was a funding of £38 million to the Wildlife Trust to restore Celtic rainforest, temperate rainforest up the west coast of the UK. So a whole number of wildlife trusts will benefit from this. It might feel like I'm just rubbing people's noses in it when we're here on the east coast and I'm talking about this huge project that we're doing on the west coast. So sorry about that, Brian and others. But we were really thrilled to be able to put together this very, very ambitious proposal for restoring Celtic rainforest over a very large area and across a zone. And the question I want to ask here is that what would be the equivalent then in the east? Probably, of course, those lowland peats that we've already been talking about, and those projects already exist, and that's fantastic, and let's try and have those expanding. But the other conversations we've had in the Wildlife Trust, which Pamela and Brian and others have been involved in over the last couple of years, is also how could we actually try and restore riverscapes at very large scale across the east of England? And I think, I mean, Pamela introduced me by saying I'm a campaigner. I'm a campaigner really as much as anything else, more than necessarily a real someone with intimate knowledge of natural history. And I think the time is right for us to really think big about riverscapes in the east of England. And why do I think that? I think it's because the zeitgeist is shifting in the public. You look at a number of things that are happening at the moment. Obviously, rivers have been in the media a great deal over the last little while. There's been a lot of attention about pollution in rivers, combined sewage overflows and so on, and rightly so, because it is shocking what's been happening there. But also, we're starting to get actually a bit of cut through into the wider public about the need for more naturalized river systems. Just one example here, but this video, for example, on the Guardian website has been viewed a huge number of times. I don't have the figures to hand actually, but it's a fantastic video. If you haven't seen it, it's a very, very good video, only 5 minutes long, explaining actually all the things that I'm sure people on this call would know about how rivers should look and why they don't look like that at the moment, and the need for that. And more, I think we're starting to get conversations in society about natural flood management, about the need for more renaturalized rivers, about rewiggling, rewilding, all these kind of terms. I do a lot of public speaking and out in communities, and it's fascinating how many questions I'm getting now about this kind of whole agenda. Again, there's a lot of references to some of the really big riverscape projects that have been done, for example, in the Netherlands, and quite a lot of media attention about that. And with those kind of big visions of about how you can try and recreate properly a properly functioning river system. And it strikes me, and I know this conversation, as I said, we've been having amongst wildlife trusts in the east of England over the last few years a little bit, that there is a big potential for this in the east of England in one form or another. Wouldn't it be magical actually to try and restore natural processes along the whole length of the Ouse, for example? Wouldn't it be magical to do that for some of our other rivers in the east as well? And of course, let's not forget our beautiful chalk streams. I mean, wonderful to see them starting to be featured in Wild Isles. And you'll see more of that over the episodes over the coming weeks. But actually, to talk about not just river pollution and the need to stop river pollution, which of course we have to do, but actually how we can restore natural processes in our rivers and to restore the river ecosystems in the east of England will be really important. We've been playing around a little bit with a concept in the wildlife trusts, in a trust in the east of England, about maybe a vision for a sort of great eastern river forest. There's a lot more thinking needs to be done about that. But to just ask ourselves a question, what could this look like? And you know, these are kind of the classic photos from some of the Dutch examples about rewilding of rivers on scale, about you have these large herds of herbivores, and the role they can play in helping recreate these ecosystems. And indeed, of course, perhaps more controversially, but I've got to mention it because lots of people do mention it, the possibility of reintroductions of other missing wetland species. Here, of course, pelicans, Dalmatian pelicans is something that is often talked about. And so my question really to the room, and interesting to get any thoughts today, but at any other time as well, is that if we were doing an equivalent map to this, but for riverscapes, and particularly in east of England, what should it look like? What might we dream of? And let's dream really big. Remember, I think it's actually going big, dreaming big, that helps us. We achieve more than dreaming small sometimes. I mean, we dreamt big with this and we got 38 million from Aviva, and in many respects is a proof of concept. So we think we can recreate this on a number of occasions. And this would be wildlife trusts, yes, but wildlife trusts working with partners to deliver it for sure as well. And I think there's a really potential. I think the zeitgeist is right in the way that we've seen, you know, quite rightly, an obsession with woodlands and trees over the last few years, and we all know why that's important. Actually, it really feels to me like the time is right for us to get people excited in the possibility of rewilding our rivers now as well. And my goodness, we need that in the east of England. And I think there'll be a potential for many partners, many businesses to get involved, because of course we can show why that's important for nature, but it's also important for our economy and for people too. So that's all I wanted to offer today. I don't claim any local knowledge other than the fact that I live here. All the local knowledge goes to Brian on that one, but just to float some big ideas and see what people think. Thank you.
Fabulous, and I'm seeing support for that in the chat as well. And I think on World Rewilding Day on Monday that there's going to be a kind of publication of all the opportunity maps for rewilding in London as well. So I think everyone is kind of onto this. Let's think big. So I think it would be fabulous if we could do this in Cambridgeshire and across the east. I think we've probably got time for maybe just one question. We've got a question from Martin, but I think that's within the Wildlife Trust family, so he maybe can ask that directly in there. And Martin Hessel, if you would just like to ask your question, and then maybe we'll go to Mike Maunder to close. I would love to have a bigger discussion about this, and maybe that could be one of the themes for the future.
Yeah, my question really was one for Craig. Is that I can't speak for the whole of Huntingdon District Council, but I know that we are starting our local plan. So the big ideas around rivers, particularly the Great Ouse. I just put up my hand to say that certainly I can offer a conversation if Craig, you wish to get in touch.
Yeah, and I think Natural Cambridgeshire is very happy to facilitate a conversation. We have Wildlife Trust as members, but we also have, that wider family, and certainly including Joe in the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, slightly over the border to a certain extent, but actually, very much part of the connected river systems. Fantastic. It just feels like this is kind of, we're slightly blown our minds today, and certainly Craig has asked a fabulous question. But I want to give Mike Maunder the opportunity to summarize and to send us off brilliantly into the future. And I think we've definitely got food for thought from all of our talks today. So I'm going to hand over to Mike. Mike is the Executive Director of Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is a collaboration between some of the larger conservation organisations based in Cambridge, both working at a global scale and at a local scale. Mike.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Brian, Joe, Neil, Philip, and Craig for some extraordinary presentations today. It's quite clear there's extraordinary expertise here in Cambridgeshire, and particularly there's a particularly fragile type of knowledge that we dismiss as natural history, and I'm just so delighted to hear it, evidence that it's thriving, and that's knowledge that is hard won and easily lost. And I think that sense of time has also come through today, from starting with Brian, who took me back to A-level geography, the wonderful Flandrian transgression and our isolation from Europe. And we've got a sense of the time and the place and the ebb and the flow of the Cambridge landscapes and Cambridgeshire biodiversity, whether it's recognizing that some of our most botanical
rich sites are Bronze Age through to the potential of bringing pelicans back, or even one that's dear to my heart, the European pond turtle, which could come back. And we probably should put a lot of money on glossy ibis coming back pretty soon. I think that's even odds on that one. So deep past, but what had been emphasized all the way through is the urgent now. And in discussions after the biodiversity COP last year in Canada, we talked about, many of us talked about a 10-year sprint to capture what we can and to create the framework for new landscapes and new conservation initiatives. And then we face the intergenerational commitment of maintaining that biodiversity and letting our restored landscapes grow and mature. So what we're doing now is putting a commitment to the next 10, 50, 100, 200 years of Cambridgeshire biodiversity and nature. It's about us being good ancestors, about leaving a legacy. And I think if we can't do it in Cambridgeshire, we can't do it anywhere. And I think a big part of this is going to be sharing data, sharing information, creating that consolidated vision. And Craig really did set the notorious cat amongst the pelicans and challenged us to think big. And I was also very delighted that he used some pictures from our endangered landscape program, pictures on, we have about 4 million hectares under active restoration across Europe with various partners that we run from here in the David Attenborough building. And by the way, Craig, we have a buried river underneath our office as well, but we're not planning to demolish. So Cambridge is set up for something grand. You've got the knowledge, you've got the wisdom, you've got the people, you've got extraordinary academic university, my colleagues in the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, particularly the Cambridge Conservation Forum. There's lots going on. So I would echo every single speaker in talking about specialist knowledge, the heritage of knowledge within Cambridgeshire, and then the future. And yes, be bold, think big, but realize we're dealing with a delicately woven cloth that includes many small sites with peculiar species that need peculiar needs. And so it's developing that multi-dimensional approach where we link, we connect, we nurture those fragile and scattered sites, but we build big and look for the landscapes that can maintain nature over the next 100, 150 years. So go forth, Cambridge, be bold. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, everyone. I learned a lot today.
That's just wonderful. Thank you for that kind of message of going forth. And there are lots of, there's so much activity at the moment. And I've just been asked to publicise one of the kind of thinking bold moments, which is a wildlife trust-led Biodiversity Has No Borders conference that's coming up on the 15th of May, looking at the role of nature in nature recovery and local nature recovery strategies. And we meet again as a partnership forum on the 14th of June. And I wonder if we need to expand. We don't have a theme yet, but it feels like we kind of perhaps could start expanding, actually what does big and bold look like for Cambridgeshire, whilst also taking into account that actually there are lots of pressures on this land. There are lots of small sites, there are lots of landowners who, would need to sort of become on board and become enthusiastic if they aren't currently, or would need to lead the way and show example if they're already doing things. So fabulous. So I think I'll close there. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It's been a brilliant session. Thank you to all of our speakers. I feel marvelously inspired in a midweek moment that one doesn't always feel that. So thank you very much. Go forth and be bold. Thank you.